The battlefield of Prime was a graveyard of twisted meta and fallen warriors. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning wreckage, smoke curling toward the sky like the dying breath of an empire. Fires flickered amidst the ruins of Dominion war machines, their husks scattered across the shattered landscape. The ground, once solid beneath the boots of an army that had known only victory, was now uneven, cratered with scars left by relentless human artillery. The Dominion forces lay broken, their formations shattered by the sheer ferocity of the Terran assault. General groaned as he pushed himself up from the wreckage of a fallen transport, his vision swimming from the impact of the blast that had thrown him. His side burned, a wound, deep but not fatal, though the pain gnawed at his focus. Around him, his soldiers lay in twisted heaps, their armor scorched, their weapons discarded. Some still clung to life, groaning in agony, their bodies twitching in the aftermath of the battle's fury. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to his feet, his claws tightening around the hilt of his plasma blade. This was not how it was supposed to be. They had come to crush the humans, to wipe their insignificant race from the stars. And yet, the tide had turned in a way he could never have anticipated. He surveyed the battlefield, searching for signs of movement among the ruins. The distant hum of human war machines echoed through the silence, but it was not the armored behemoths of their frontline forces that caught his attention. It was the soldiers now advancing through the battlefield. Their armor gleamed white against the ground, marked with red crosses that stood out even through the haze of war. They moved with precision, their weapons drawn, scanning the battlefield as they advanced. Mind struggled to process the sight. Medics. Human medics. But why were they armed? One of the human medics knelt beside a fallen soldier, working quickly to stabilize his wounds, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Gaze flicked to another, who approached one of his own wounded warriors. The Dominion soldier, barely clinging to life, reached up weakly as if pleading for mercy. The human medic paused, studying him for a brief moment, then raised his weapon and fired. The Dominion warrior slumped back, motionless, his final breath stolen without hesitation. Heart pounded in his chest. This was no act of mercy. This was something else. A calculated extermination. He watched as the human medics continued their grim work, saving their own while eliminating any potential threats. They moved like ghosts, their presence both a promise of salvation and a harbinger of death. The Dominion had always believed in the sanctity of battlefield roles. Warriors fought, medics healed. The idea that a healer could also be an executioner was unthinkable. And yet, here they were. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to step forward, his boots crunching against the rubble. A few of his remaining warriors stirred at his movement, their eyes flickering with the last embers of defiance. He could not let this stand. If these humans had rewritten the rules of war, then he would answer with the only thing he had left, strength. Raising his plasma blade, he let out a roar, a sound that cut through the stillness, an unspoken challenge to these enemies who dared mark the Dominion's understanding of battle. The nearest human medic turned, his weapon shifting instantly toward his stance unshaken. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation. He had seen battle before, and he knew exactly how this would end. Lunged, his blade slicing through the air with the full force of his remaining strength. The medic sidestepped effortlessly, the motion fluid, practiced. A sharp crack rang out. Pain exploded through, just as he staggered, the world tilting beneath him. His breath caught, his vision darkening at the edges as he dropped to his knees. The human medic stood over him, lowering his weapon, his gaze impassive. Gasped, struggling to focus on the face of his executioner. His mind grasped at the last fragments of understanding, the words slipping past his lips in a broken whisper. The air was thick with the stench of war, burning matter, blood, and the acrid tang of plasma discharge. Smoke called into the twilight sky, casting long shadows over the broken landscape. The Dominion's stronghold lay in ruins, its towering battlements reduced to crumbling husks. The distant echoes of scattered gunfire marked the final pockets of resistance, but for the most part, the battle was over. The humans had won. Captain Elias Carter moved with purpose through the wreckage, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the field for survivors. His squad followed, but his attention was fixed on another unit moving ahead of them, the medics. Their stark white armor, marked with red crosses, stood in sharp contrast to the blackened ruins around them. They were ghosts in the aftermath, moving with eerie precision. They stepped over bodies with practiced efficiency, their helmets concealing whatever emotions they might have felt. Some knelt beside wounded humans, administering aid with calm, measured movements. Others approached the fallen Dominion soldiers. And just like before, Carter knew exactly what would happen next. He watched as one of the medics approached a wounded Dominion warrior, a hulking brute of a soldier, his reptilian features contorted in pain. His chest armor was cracked open, blood pooling beneath him. The alien's golden eyes flickered up at the human standing over him, filled with something Carter had never seen in the eyes of a Dominion warrior before: fear. The medic paused for a moment, assessing the situation. Then, with a single fluid motion, he drew his sidearm and fired. The shot echoed briefly before being swallowed by the eerie silence of the battlefield. The Dominion soldier slumped back, his body finally still. The medic holstered his weapon and moved on, stepping over the corpse without a second glance. Carter exhaled slowly, adjusting the strap of his rifle. He had seen this before, and yet, it never ceased to unsettle him. The Dominion still didn't understand. They had spent decades waging war across the stars, conquering planets with brute force and superior firepower. But they had never fought an enemy like humanity. A voice crackled in his earpiece. "Captain, got a live van here. Looks like an officer." Carter turned, making his way toward the signal. His boots crunched against shattered glass and debris as he approached his squad. They stood in a loose semicircle around a Dominion officer, one of the few still breathing. He was wounded but alive, propped up against the ruins of a collapsed bunker. His armor was dented and smeared with dirt and blood, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Carter knelt beside him, studying his face. The officer was old, his ridged brow furrowed in pain and confusion. But there was something else in his gaze, something that hadn't been there before. "You're the first Dominion officer we've found still breathing," Carter said, his tone almost conversational. "Unlucky or lucky, depending on how you look at it." The alien coughed, his sharp teeth stained with blood. "You'd fight without honor," he rasped. Carter smirked. "Honor? That's rich, coming from the Dominion." The officer's gaze flicked toward the medics in the distance. Another shot rang out, another Dominion soldier executed. His hands clenched into trembling fists. Your healers, they kill." Carter's smirk faded. He studied the alien for a moment before glancing back toward the field. The medics continued their grim work, saving those they could, ensuring the enemy would never rise again. He turned back to the officer and shrugged. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice quieter now. "You've spent your whole existence believing wars are won with superior weapons, superior numbers. But you never understood what it takes to actually survive." The officer's breathing was growing weaker, but he was still listening. "You think we're monsters," Carter continued. "You think this is cruelty. But to us, it's just efficiency. We learned a long time ago, if you want to win, you don't just fight battles. You end them." He stood up, rolling his shoulders. The officer coughed again, his body shuddering with the effort. He knew what was coming next. Carter nodded to the medic standing nearby. Without hesitation, the soldier raised his sidearm. The officer's final words were barely above a whisper. "We never stood a chance." The Dominion war camp was in chaos. Fires raged, casting flickering shadows across the battered landscape, while the sounds of distant gunfire and screaming filled the air. The command center now lay in ruins, its walls blasted apart, consoles sparking, and alien bodies strewn across the floor. Human soldiers moved through the wreckage like wraiths, methodical and efficient, their black combat armor blending with the smoke and ash. Lieutenant Sarah Hayes led her unit through the shattered remains of what had once been the Dominion's main strategic outpost on the planet. They moved swiftly, clearing rooms with practiced ease, stepping over the bodies of fallen warriors. Most of the resistance had already been crushed, but there were still scattered pockets of Dominion soldiers attempting to regroup. It wouldn't matter. Humanity had come prepared. The Dominion had been expecting a prolonged war of attrition. Instead, they had faced something far worse: merciless precision. Their supply lines had been cut before they could react, their forward bases sabotaged, their strongest warriors outmaneuvered at every turn. It wasn't just that humanity was winning. It was the way they were doing it. Cold, efficient, and unrelenting. The Dominion's warriors were trained for brutal, glorious combat. The humans fought as if war was nothing more than a problem to be solved. Hayes signaled to her squad, and they stacked up outside a reinforced chamber, the least secured room in the camp. From inside, she could hear harried voices speaking in Dominion's guttural, growling language. They were afraid. That alone told her how badly the tide had turned. She gestured, and her demolition specialist moved forward, planting a small charge on the door's locking mechanism. 3 seconds, the soldier murmured. The charge detonated with a sharp crack, the reinforced metal door blowing inward. Her squad surged through the breach, weapons raised, scanning for threats. Inside, a handful of Dominion officers stood around a massive holographic war table, their faces twisting in shock and fury. Hayes took a moment to absorb the scene. The war table was still active, displaying shifting red and blue lines, battlefronts, tactical overlays, troop deployments. It was all useless now. Their communications were gone, their reinforcements cut off, and their best warriors dead or captured. One of the officers, a towering reptilian with ceremonial armor and deep scars running across his face, let out a guttural snarl and reached for his weapon. He didn't even get the chance to lift it before a single suppressed shot rang out. He staggered, a hole punched clean through his forehead, before collapsing against the table. The other officers flinched. Their hands hovered near their weapons, but none of them dared to move. They had already seen how this played out. Hayes stepped forward, lowering her rifle slightly but keeping her finger on the trigger. "Which one of you is in charge?" she asked. A moment of hesitation, then one of the aliens, a grizzled commandant with faded markings on his armor, straightened. His golden eyes locked onto hers, a flicker of defiance still burning within them. "You fight without honor," he spat. "Like scavengers. No warrior's pride. No glory." Hayes exhaled sharply through her nose, unimpressed. "And look where your glory got you." The officer's jaw clenched. Around him, his fellow commandants stood motionless, waiting for what came next. Hayes gestured toward the war table, where the holographic display still flickered weakly. "Do you see this? You thought this war would be fought like the ones before it. You thought we'd meet you in open battle, clash blade against blade, like some ancient ritual." She leaned forward slightly. "But that's not how we fight. We don't care about honor. We care about winning." The officer's fists clenched at his sides. "You are cowards," he hissed. "Sending medics who kill. Assassins who wear no uniforms. You." Hayes tilted her head slightly, cutting him off. "That's your biggest problem," she said, her voice quieter now. "You've spent too long thinking war is about who swings the biggest sword. But war is about who survives." She turned her head slightly as a new presence entered the room. A medic, clad in the familiar white and red armor, stepped inside. And like the soldiers, his weapon wasn't slung across his back. It was already in his hand. The officer's gaze flickered toward the weapon, his throat tightening. The medic paused, looking around the room, assessing the wounded Dominion officers with the same clinical detachment he would a human casualty. Then he turned his visor toward Hayes. "Are we keeping any of them?" The silence that followed was deafening. Hayes studied the officer in front of her, watching as understanding dawned in his reptilian eyes. He had finally realized what his people had failed to understand from the start. The humans didn't just fight. They ended wars. She gave a slight shake of her head. The medic didn't hesitate. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession, the sharp reports echoing through the ruined war room. The last Dominion commandant slumped forward, his body joining the others in a lifeless heap. The medic holstered his weapon and turned to leave. "Clear," he said simply, stepping back out into the burning night. Hayes exhaled and glanced back at the war table one last time. The Dominion had come expecting conquest. Instead, they had met something far worse. The Dominion's last stronghold on the planet was collapsing. Smoke billowed into the night sky, the distant echoes of gunfire growing sporadic as the last remnants of alien resistance were snuffed out. Human soldiers moved with precision through the ruined structures, clearing buildings, securing targets, and ensuring that no survivors would be left to regroup. The war was effectively over. The Dominion just hadn't accepted it yet. Inside the shattered remains of what had once been the enemy's command center, General lay slumped against a broken console, his golden eyes flickering as he struggled to focus. The searing pain in his abdomen told him he was mortally wounded, his own blood pooling beneath him. Around him, his officers lay in still heaps, their bodies riddled with bullet holes. The war room was now a graveyard, the walls scorched by gunfire, the massive holographic display flickering with the remnants of a lost war. The sound of footsteps echoed through the chamber, slow and deliberate. Forced himself to look up, his vision swimming. A group of human soldiers entered, moving with the same eerie calm that had defined their entire campaign. They did not revel in their victory, did not taunt their dying foes. They simply did their job. Behind them, a figure stepped forward, one of their medics. Mind reeled. A medic. He had watched them from afar before, clad in their white and red armor, tending to their wounded with efficiency. But he had also seen them in battle, their weapons raised just as quickly as their medical kits. He had seen them kill with the same precision as their soldiers. It had been one of the first things that unsettled him about this war, something that had lingered in his mind from the very beginning. Why did their medics carry guns? The human knelt beside him, scanning him with a small handheld device. The cold, blue light of the scanner washed over battered body, and for a brief, insane moment, hope flickered in his mind. Was he being treated? Would he be spared? The Dominion did not take prisoners. Surrender was dishonor. But perhaps humans were different? Then the medic's visor tilted slightly. He glanced at the scanner's readings, exhaled through his nose, and without hesitation, pulled his sidearm free. Throat tightened. A single shot rang out. The Dominion general's body jerked, his final breath escaping in a ragged gasp. His golden eyes, once filled with pride and rage, glazed over, staring blankly at the ruined ceiling above. The medic stood up, holstering his weapon without ceremony. "No point wasting supplies," he murmured, already moving on to scan another body. One of the soldiers beside him snorted softly. "Yeah, pretty sure the oath doesn't apply to war criminals." The squad moved methodically through the room, ensuring there were no survivors left. There was no cruelty in their actions, just efficiency. The Dominion had come to this planet expecting a glorious campaign, a swift conquest over a weaker species. Instead, they had encountered something far worse. Humans did not fight for honor or spectacle. They fought to win. Outside, the final pockets of Dominion resistance were being extinguished. Their fleet had been annihilated in orbit, their supply lines severed, their reinforcements cut off before they had even known they were under attack. The few surviving Dominion soldiers had dropped their weapons, surrendering not out of cowardice, but out of the simple realization that they were fighting an enemy they could not comprehend. The humans had no great speeches, no dramatic declarations of victory. There was only the cold efficiency of cleanup. A soldier stepped outside, looking up at the night sky where human dropships loomed overhead. Think they'll try again? He asked absently. Another soldier beside him shrugged, lighting a cigarette. Doubt it. Word's gonna spread. Even the Dominion isn't dumb enough to come back after this. Behind them, the medic emerged from the ruined command center, his job done. He adjusted the strap of his pack, nodded toward the field commandant, and spoke in the same calm, detached tone as always. Area secure. There was no celebration, no victory cries, only the quiet efficiency of soldiers who had done their job. The Dominion had expected to conquer. Instead, they had been taught a final, brutal lesson. And as the last human soldiers boarded their ships, leaving behind nothing but ruin, the message became clear to anyone who would dare challenge them again. War was not about glory. War was about survival. And humanity had already mastered it.